Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at a really important issue that we've been seeing more and more of lately. And that is women going to their doctors with legitimate physical ailments only to kind of get the runaround and have their symptoms chalked up to mental health.
Yeah, it's really concerning.
Yeah.
Definitely something we need to talk about.
And to really dig into this, we're going to be referencing a recent Smithsonian article called, "For Some Women with Serious Physical Ailments, Mental Illness Has Become a Scapegoat Diagnosis."
It's a fascinating article.
It is.
It's really eye-opening.
So we're going to try to do a deep dive here into, who is most affected by this, what are the consequences of it, and what are some of the potential paths forward.
Yeah, what can we do about it?
Exactly.
That's the big question.
So the article starts off with a really powerful story about a woman named Veronica Denner. She was experiencing some pretty alarming physical symptoms. Blood in her stool, severe pain, things that would understandably send anyone running to the doctor.
Absolutely.
And that's exactly what she did.
Right.
But it's kind of shocking how quickly her symptoms were sort of interpreted through the lens of her personal history.
Yeah.
She had experienced childhood trauma,
Okay.
and she was also dealing with the normal stresses of being a busy college student.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so right away, it seemed like there was this assumption that maybe her physical symptoms were stemming from her mental and emotional state.
It's interesting how there's often this rush to find a psychological root to physical symptoms.
Right.
Especially for women, it seems.
Yeah, and it's almost like before a thorough investigation of potential physical causes has even been undertaken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Jump to that conclusion.
Yeah. So despite these tangible complaints, the initial medical test that Veronica underwent came back normal. And that seems to be a real turning point in a lot of these stories.
Yeah.
Because that's when the dismissive comments started coming. For Veronica, she was labeled a drama queen and even incredibly a psychopath.
A psychopath.
Which, I mean, can you imagine being told that when you're experiencing real physical distress?
It's shocking. And sadly, it's not as uncommon as we'd like to think.
It's not.
Yeah.
And the article touches on this frustration that some doctors seem to have when they can't pinpoint a diagnosis right away. Instead of acknowledging the limitations of current testing or even their own knowledge in a particular area, the focus shifts to questioning the patient.
Yeah.
And sometimes in ways that are deeply invalidating.
And that can really undermine a patient's trust in the healthcare system.
Absolutely. And so in Veronica's case, it turned out that she actually had a really aggressive form of endometriosis, which of course is a condition that affects a significant number of women.
Absolutely.
But instead of receiving that diagnosis and getting the treatment that she needed, her concerns were dismissed. And she was actually prescribed anxiety medication.
Oh, wow.
Which just adds insult to injury, really.
Yeah. It's like they're trying to put a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem.
Yeah. And this brings us to a really significant statistic that the article highlights. Over a third of endometriosis patients are initially misdiagnosed with mental health conditions.
Wow, that's a huge number.
It's huge. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, this often leads to an average delay of over 4 years in receiving an accurate endometriosis diagnosis in the United States.
4 years.
4 years.
That's a long time to be suffering.
It's a long time.
And for the disease to potentially progress.
Absolutely.
Really untreated.
And it's not just endometriosis. The article cites a study that found that 36% of patients with lupus and other autoimmune diseases reported similar experiences of being misdiagnosed with mental health issues or what are often called medically unexplained symptoms.
Right, so this is a much broader issue.
It is. It's not limited to just one specific condition.
It seems like there's this tendency to use mental health as a catch-all explanation when doctors can't figure out what's going on. The article actually uses the term scapegoat diagnosis,
Right.
which I think is really apt.
It is.
Because it's like when healthcare providers can't readily identify a physical explanation for a patient's symptoms, a mental health diagnosis becomes this convenient,
Right.
albeit incorrect, default. Yeah.
So let's delve into why this might be happening.
Okay, let's do it.
The article points to a few key factors, one of which seems to be a hesitancy among doctors to admit when they don't have all the answers.
That's interesting because there's this pressure
There is.
in the medical field to have that immediate diagnosis, to have all the answers.
The article actually quotes Veronica as saying, sometimes doctors have a real problem with saying, I don't know.
Yeah.
Or let's refer you to a specialist.
Like they feel like they're failing if they don't have a solution right away.
And it's interesting because the article also makes the point that sometimes patients themselves are uncomfortable with a doctor admitting uncertainty.
That's true.
You know?
We as patients kind of expect them to have the answers.
You want them to.
Yeah.
So it creates this complex dynamic.
It does.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's the very real constraint of time
Oh, absolutely.
in today's healthcare system. Consultation times can be incredibly brief.
Yeah, sometimes you feel like you're just rushed in and out.
Yeah.
You barely have time to explain what's going on.
The article mentions an emergency physician who reported having as little as 3 minutes
3 minutes.
to assess a patient in some situations.
That's crazy.
It's crazy, right?
How can you possibly make an accurate diagnosis in 3 minutes?
It's really hard to do a thorough assessment in such a short amount of time.
It really pushes doctors towards making quick decisions.
Yes.
Sometimes without having all the information.
Yeah. And it seems like this tendency to kind of jump to conclusions or make quick decisions might actually be ingrained early in medical training.
Oh, interesting. How so?
The article discusses the illness script model that's taught in medical school. And essentially what it is students are taught to recognize patterns of symptoms and then associate them with specific diagnoses.
That makes sense.
Right.
It's like a mental shortcut.
Yeah, it's a way to make things more efficient. But the problem is, as the article highlights, when a patient's presentation doesn't neatly fit into one of these predefined scripts,
Right.
when their symptoms are atypical,
Yeah.
some doctors can get perplexed.
Mm.
And instead of broadening their differential diagnosis
Yeah.
or considering less common conditions, there can be this tendency to default to a psychological explanation.
It's almost like if the data doesn't fit the model,
Right.
they blame the data instead of questioning the model itself.
Exactly. And then there's our societal reliance on diagnostic tests.
Yeah, we put so much faith in tests.
We do. We view them as this ultimate objective truth. But the article points out that a significant proportion of diagnostic tests are actually deemed inappropriate.
Inappropriate,
Yeah.
meaning they're not really necessary or helpful in that situation.
Right. But even when they are inappropriate, a negative result can often be interpreted as definitive proof that nothing is physically wrong.
Right.
And this can completely invalidate the patient's experience.
And their symptoms.
Yes.
It's like their lived experience is being dismissed.
Exactly. A
Yep.
good example of this is endometriosis, which often doesn't show up on standard ultrasounds. So a woman could be experiencing debilitating pain, but because the ultrasound is negative, her pain might be dismissed.
Oh, that's so frustrating.
It's incredibly frustrating. It's like the assumption is if the test is negative, you must be fine.
Even though you're clearly saying you're not.
Right. And now the article also makes a strong point that women are disproportionately affected by this issue.
Yeah. Why is that?
It's a good question, right? And I think if we consider the historical context, the development of medical knowledge has largely been based on what the article refers to as the male model,
The male model.
meaning that medical research and understanding of, anatomy and physiology has often used the male body as the standard. So women's bodies and their unique ways of presenting symptoms have sometimes been viewed as deviations from the norm.
Interesting.
Yeah, so when women's symptoms don't align perfectly with this male model, they're more likely to be dismissed as psychological.
Instead of being recognized as valid physical symptoms.
Exactly. The article shares a really telling anecdote from a chronic pain influencer named Jessica Wetstein. And she talks about how women with bowel issues are routinely asked if they are sure it's not just their period.
Oh,
Which is just,
that's so dismissive.
it's so dismissive. And it just highlights that automatic association of women's physical complaints with their reproductive system.
Right. It's like their pain is being minimized.
It is.
And attributed to something that's normal for women.
Exactly. And it really reinforces this idea that women aren't always seen as reliable interpreters of their own bodily experiences.
That's a big problem.
It's a huge problem. And the article also points out that statistically, women are diagnosed with mental health disorders more frequently than men, which is a significant health concern
It is.
in itself.
It is.
But it can contribute to a diagnostic bias, where any unexplained symptoms in a woman are quickly attributed to a mental health condition.
Right. It's like a shortcut
It is.
based on statistics,
In-
stereotypes.
And stereotypes.
Yeah.
There are these social stereotypes that portray women as inherently more emotional
Mm.
which can also play a role in this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like there's this preconceived notion that women
Yes.
are more likely to overreact or be overly dramatic.
And it's almost like we're saying, okay, a woman presents with symptoms, plus no obvious physical cause is identified, equals likely a mental health issue.
Yeah, it's a dangerous equation.
It is a dangerous equation.
Yeah.
And the article even touches on the very problematic historical concept of female hysteria.
Female hysteria. That's such an outdated concept.
It's so outdated, but it's fascinating and honestly kind of disturbing to think that maybe some of those underlying biases might still linger today.
Oh, I'm sure they do in some ways.
Yeah, manifesting in diagnoses like conversion disorder or anxiety, it's like this legacy of dismissing women's health concerns as being rooted in their emotions or their reproductive organs.
Instead of taking them seriously and looking for potential physical causes.
Exactly. And then the article goes on to discuss the concept of the misdiagnosis spiral,
The misdiagnosis spiral.
which sounds incredibly damaging for patients.
Yeah. How does that work?
Well, essentially, an initial mental health misdiagnosis can create what's known as anchoring bias.
Anchoring bias.
So, once a patient has a diagnosis like anxiety or depression documented in their medical record, subsequent healthcare providers might be more inclined to focus on that existing diagnosis when the patient presents with new or worsening symptoms.
Oh, so they might not even consider other possibilities.
Right. They might not fully investigate,
Mm.
potential new or evolving physical issues.
That's really concerning.
It is. And the article gives the example of Jessica Vetstein, who was labeled with depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder.
Wow.
And so because of these pre-existing mental health diagnoses, her very real physical symptoms were consistently dismissed.
Dismissed.
Yeah, were attributed to, her mental health.
It's like that initial label becomes a filter
Yes.
through which all their future health concerns are seen.
It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And tragically, these delays can have really devastating consequences for a patient's health.
Of course.
Yeah. The article details how a delayed diagnosis, particularly for conditions like endometriosis, can lead to a progression of the disease, causing organ damage, impacting fertility, and potentially leading to much more invasive interventions later on.
Wow. So it's not just a minor inconvenience.
Right.
It can have really serious consequences.
It can. And here's the really cruel irony of it all. The chronic pain and suffering that results from an undiagnosed physical illness can actually lead to the development of mental health issues,
Oh, wow.
like anxiety and depression.
So the misdiagnosis itself can
Uh-huh.
actually contribute to the mental health issues.
Exactly. It becomes this really vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's like a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah, and the article talks about Jessica Westein's experience of internalizing blame for her worsening symptoms. She thought that it was her fault,
Oh, no.
that she wasn't managing her mental illness well enough, when in reality, it was an undiagnosed physical condition.
That's heartbreaking.
It is.
To think that she was blaming herself
Yeah.
for something that was completely out of her control.
And it wasn't until 14 years later
Green years.
that she finally received an accurate diagnosis
Wow.
of hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
That's a long time to suffer.
It's a long time. And it just speaks to the profound psychological impact of medical gaslighting and misdiagnosis.
Right, because when you're not believed,
Yeah.
it can really mess with your head.
It can.
You start to doubt yourself
You do.
and your own experiences.
Absolutely. And your own body. So the article does a really good job of painting this clear and concerning picture of the problem. So now the question is, what can we do about it?
Yeah, what are some potential paths towards change?
Right. What are the solutions? And the article emphasizes that meaningful change really needs to start within medical education itself.
Okay.
There needs to be better, more comprehensive training in the diagnosis and management of psychiatric conditions.
Yeah, because sometimes it seems like mental health diagnoses are used as a quick fix
Right.
when a doctor doesn't have time to fully investigate.
Yeah. But equally crucial is this reminder that the absence of evidence for a physical ailment does not automatically equate to the presence of a mental illness.
That's so important to remember.
It is.
Because just because you can't find a physical cause
Right.
doesn't mean it's all in the patient's head.
Exactly. And this is especially important when we're talking about the diagnosis of somatic symptom disorder,
Somatic symptom disorder.
which can sometimes be misapplied when a physical cause hasn't been identified yet, rather than definitively indicating a psychological origin for the symptoms.
Right, so doctors need to be really careful about that diagnosis.
They do. And the article also emphasizes the critical importance of actively listening to patients.
Oh, absolutely.
In our fast-paced, technology-driven medical environment, the patient's narrative, their own account of their symptoms and how they're experiencing them, can often get lost.
Yeah, sometimes you feel like you're just talking to a computer screen.
Right. But the article underscores the profound power of simply taking a few extra moments to connect with the patient and actively listen to their story
Yeah.
without jumping to conclusions.
Just hearing those words, I believe you,
Right.
can make a world of difference.
It can. And even seemingly small gestures, like a doctor saying, I don't know exactly what's going on yet, but what you're experiencing is real and valid. Those words can have a tremendous impact
They can.
on validating a patient's experience
Mm-hmm.
and fostering a more collaborative and ultimately more accurate diagnostic process.
Right. It's about building trust and rapport.
Exactly. And I think it comes down to something that the article subtly touches on, which is intellectual humility.
Intellectual humility.
This willingness on the part of healthcare providers
Yeah.
to acknowledge when they don't have all the answers
Yeah.
and to be open to alternative explanations.
To admit that they don't know everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially when the initial assessment doesn't provide a clear diagnosis.
That's a sign of strength, not weakness.
It is. It's about shifting away from this pressure to always be certain
Mm-hmm.
and embracing a more exploratory approach.
Yeah, a more collaborative approach with the patient.
Absolutely. If a patient's symptoms don't align with a preconceived diagnosis or the standard illness script, there needs to be that willingness
Mm-hmm.
to reconsider, to explore other possibilities, and even seek out consultation with specialists.
Right. It's about being thorough
It is.
and not giving up until you find an answer.
Yeah. And the article also really empowers patients. It highlights the crucial role of patient advocacy.
Patient advocacy.
Yes. Veronica Denner's experience is a really powerful example of this. She and many of her friends only received a diagnosis for endometriosis after they specifically brought up the condition to their doctors,
Wow.
often based on their own research or conversations within online communities.
So they had to do their own homework.
They did, and advocate for themselves because their doctors weren't necessarily listening.
That's so empowering.
It is, and I think it's a reminder to all of us that we need to be proactive in our own healthcare.
Absolutely.
We need to educate ourselves about our bodies and our conditions, and we need to feel empowered to speak up,
To ask questions. Yes.
to push back if we feel like we're not being heard.
Exactly. And for those who might feel less confident or less knowledgeable about advocating for themselves, the article suggests bringing a trusted loved one to medical appointments.
Oh, that's a good idea.
It's a really good idea. A friend or family member can provide that objective perspective. They can point out changes in your health that you might not even notice yourself.
Right, because you're so used to your own body.
Right.
You might not realize how much you've changed.
Exactly. And they can also act as an additional advocate, making sure that your concerns are heard and that thorough investigations are being pursued.
Yeah, it's like having a second set of ears.
It is. And a second voice in the room.
Especially important for women
Yes.
who might have a history of their concerns being dismissed.
Absolutely. And it's also really interesting how the article touches on the growing role of online communities and shared knowledge among patients.
That's fascinating.
It is.
Because it's like patients are taking control.
They are of their own health information.
Yeah. Online communities, such as those found on TikTok,
TikTok.
can provide patients with the specific language and information they need to communicate their symptoms to their doctors.
Oh, that's so helpful.
It's incredibly helpful.
Because sometimes you don't even know the right words to use.
You don't.
Oh.
And they can also help patients identify potential diagnoses based on the shared experiences of others.
Right, because you might be reading about other people's experiences and thinking, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I'm going through.
Exactly. And then you can go to your doctor and say, hey, have you considered this? Have you looked into this?
That's so empowering.
It is. And Jessica Wetstein's journey with her connective tissue disorder underscores how valuable these online spaces can be, especially for navigating rare or misunderstood conditions.
It's like a support system.
It is.
And a source of information all rolled into one.
Yeah. So it seems like the long-term goal here is a much broader approach, involving education.
Education for everyone.
Yeah. Education for healthcare professionals, to dismantle ingrained biases, to improve their diagnostic abilities, and education for patients, to become more informed and empowered advocates for their own health.
Yeah, knowledge is power.
It really is. So to kind of bring it all together,
Yeah.
what this deep dive into the Smithsonian article reveals is a really concerning reality. For a significant number of women, the path to receiving an accurate diagnosis for a serious underlying physical illness is being obstructed by this tendency within the healthcare system to prematurely default to mental health diagnoses.
Right, and that's a problem.
It's a big problem. And it's driven by all these different factors, ingrained patterns of medical training, pressures of time constraints, deeply rooted societal biases, and even these outdated historical stereotypes.
It's a complex issue.
It is a very complex issue, and it's
Yeah.
important to emphasize that this isn't about diminishing the importance of mental health. Mental health is incredibly important, but it's about recognizing that there are instances where genuine physical symptoms are being incorrectly attributed to psychological causes. And this leads to these delays in treatment. And it causes immense and often unnecessary suffering.
It's about getting the right diagnosis
Yes.
and the right treatment.
And the insights from this article underscore the need for increased awareness of this potential diagnostic pitfall.
Both within the medical community
Yes,
and among patients.
exactly. So this has been a really enlightening deep dive.
It
I hope
does.
it's given you a lot to think about. And I'd like to leave you with this question. Considering everything we've discussed today, the challenges within medical education, the pervasive impact of bias, the crucial role of patient advocacy, and the power of online communities, what do you believe are the most impactful steps that can be taken to ensure that all patients, regardless of their gender or the complexity of their condition, receive accurate and timely diagnoses?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. So I'd love for you to reflect on that and maybe even share your thoughts with us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. And thanks for joining us for this deep dive.